Come and join me as we dive into the world of careers, uncovering the reality behind the job titles you've always wondered about and how you can chart your path to success. Whether you're starting out or dreaming of a new role, I'm here to guide you. Real talk, real jobs, real insight, providing career clarity, one conversation at a time. Welcome to Work Uncovered. Hi, I'm Terri Homans, career consultant and founder of Curated Careers. In today's episode, we're exploring higher education from behind the scenes, where we look at the campus roles that support students through learning, well-being and success, but from outside the classroom. My guest, Shane Taas, is a student engagement and higher education professional based on the Gold Coast, with experience in creating positive and supportive student experiences across the education sector. Currently an assistant campus manager, he's built a strong background in student services, volunteering, and community engagement initiatives. Shane is passionate about fostering meaningful connections, supporting student wellbeing, and enhancing campus culture through collaboration and leadership. He's also actively contributing to the community and sporting organisations through volunteer and leadership roles. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Terri.
So Shane, you've worked across a lot of student-facing roles, campus-based roles that is. Could you give the listeners some idea of the types of things that you've been doing in the past?
Yeah, so when I started working in the education sector, I worked for an English language school in Surfers Paradise. So that role required me to sort of be the front of house for all the students coming in and out of the campus as well. So it was a great way to connect with the students, greeting them when they arrive and just helping them with a lot of administration sort of inquiries or questions. And they usually range from, ID cards, ways to, open up a bank account, things that a lot of international students are looking to obtain during their time of their studies. And then as my career progressed, I started looking at more other opportunities beyond sort of the ELICOS sector. So I moved down to Melbourne briefly to work for Deakin University and worked in the student accommodation space. So just assisting with a lot of the students around dealing with accommodation and just handling with all the different inquiries that they have around, living in the uni space. And then pretty much once COVID hit, it was pretty much a pivot from the international sector onto domestic. So then I sort of worked along with TAFE Queensland, working with the schools program, visiting all the high schools across the Queensland sector, just having a look to see what was available for students to study after they completed their high school. And then I moved to Griffith University, where I worked for both the Student Guild, so that's supporting students with all welfare sort of issues alongside with, ways to engage and interact socially, and then also with Griffith College as well. So sort of my career has sort of pivoted in so many different ways, but sort of the primary focus is making sure that our students are well engaged and well prepared for their studies and also for their extracurricular activities.
Okay. So when people hear working in higher education, they often think of, lecturers and academics. So how would you describe the role that you're now doing?
Yeah. So in my role, I'm the assistant campus manager. So partly of that role, I look after a group of student experience officers who are the front facing of, all student questions and inquiries. But in addition, I also have various different departments within our organization. So I'll be working alongside recruitment managers and system analysts, admissions officers, and along with our campus manager who comes in, once or twice a week on campus just to make sure that the operations and the functions of the campus are running smoothly. And that happens not just off campus, but also during campus as well. So for me, it's been a great career journey from working, sort of behind desk and engaging with students to now doing a combination of both, where I'm managing a team, but then equally managing well-esteemed colleagues who, are very skill set as well. But in addition to that, I also have to manage sort of most of the lecturers that come here from an operational perspective. So I think what often happens is that higher education, there's often this sort of perception of, it's just, lecturers and teachers and facilitators. But, in sort of my role, there needs to be, sort of a first point of call when it comes to sort of things like, can we get milk for our coffee? Or do you have any pens that I could use for the whiteboard? So there are always those things that you have to manage, but then equally it's also ensuring that they're getting the support and welfare needs that they have, not just, managing a class, but also making sure that they're running the trimester quite smoothly for them as well.
Lovely. Good to hear somebody's doing all that little work in the background to make it all run smoothly.
Of
So,
course, yes.
can you tell us then, if we take a step back, how did you first step into student-facing roles? I'm guessing that's not where you started at the beginning of your career.
Yeah. So I had a background working in sales and marketing. So I worked in the cinemas throughout most of my high school, sort of almost my uni life. And I had a real interest in, doing a lot of marketing and promotions. My very first full-time job was actually with a homegrown mini golf company that was based in Service Paradise. And also they had a site down in Ballarat. So what I enjoyed was having to test sort of my knowledge in the sales and marketing field with an area that I'm familiar with, but then equally taking that to a rural area. And because I was developing such great relationships with a lot of organizations and businesses that are sort of having the core of trying to get as many patrons involved or, getting as many people in, it was really vital that I network and connected with a lot of the industry professionals within the tourism space. I had a bit of a pivotal moment in my career where I kind of wanted to look for other opportunities beyond sort of sales and marketing, because it sort of was a bit of a rinse and repeat. And thankfully, one of my contacts that I worked with at the cinemas had a job as an activities officer for an English language school. Now, I've never had any experience with education. I did not know, what kind of students I was dealing with. You make the assumption that it could be, high school students, primary school students, but little did I know that I was dealing with students that had English as their second language, but then equally they are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, as they call it. They're the ones that are looking for opportunities to really explore and get to see what Australia is really meant for. I think the love of the education sector started to grow on me once it was more than just organizing those activities and events for the students. It's building those relationships to ensure that they have an amazing time in Australia, because they're spending quite a bit of money here in Australia just to study English or get that degree. Equally, it's those little extracurricular events and activities and moments that they're going to really treasure more. And then for me, it was just making sure that every student that comes through to Australia and study with you, they're the ones that are, you really want to take care and nurture, because they're the ones that are going to build a really positive experience for other future students or their friends to consider coming down to Australia and studying.
Fantastic. So this was a deliberate career direction then, and I'm guessing it's just evolved then role by role. You've obviously taken on more responsibility and a broader scope as you've gone along.
Yeah. So from there, it wasn't just thinking about doing just organizing events and activities. So doing that role as an activities officer, did it for 5 years. I managed to sort of dip my fingers into learning other elements of the education sector. I think one area that I sort of had a focus on was understanding, what the ELICOS sector was, sort of all the acronyms that are sort of invested with quite a lot of people. So, and I think from there, it was just tapping into that sort of understanding of, how do we get from that initial inquiry from a student who is on the other side of the world to consider having an education here in Australia. So once I was in there, I was sort of also learning all the different little microscopes of how, an organization would run. So for me, with the admissions process, for example, it's more than just putting an application in. It's understanding, what kind of ID checks that needs to be done. We need to know whether the students can financially support themselves when they come here to Australia. So, and that to me was quite fascinating, because it's one thing to have a look from the lens of someone on the outside, like, oh, it's just an application form to put in there. Here are some documents and that's my application. But then there's those other layers. It's like, okay, they need to have a confirmation of enrollment to confirm that they're studying at this institution. And then they also have to have demonstrated that they have financial stability to make sure that they can stay and actually study in the country as well. So really fascinating to really broaden my scope beyond just the knowledge I had from sales and marketing. I mean, obviously, sales and marketing did play a role in how I was promoting some of the events and activities for the students, but it sort of gave me a bit of new life in how I sort of developed in my role and utilizing all the skills that I've had into other future career pathways as well.
In your role now, what does a typical week look like? And I know these will fluctuate obviously through a semester because semesters go through very specific sort of cycles. But what does a typical week look like in student support or student experience or campus operations? You can combine all of that or kind of give an example of each because they can be independent of each other, those types of roles.
Absolutely. So I think for me, like where it usually starts is that you sort of have a look and check just to make sure that the campus is still happening, like it's still open, it's still working. And I think as much as it's sort of like, the sort of standard Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 sort of thing, you never know what could happen when you walk through the door. So you're often having to just make sure that you're cross-checking just to see that everything is sort of managed, accordingly to the day's schedule. So if you've got classes lined up ready to go, you pretty much make sure that the rooms are cleaned, making sure that it sets that standard for those students that are coming in. When you're walking through the door, it's just making sure that you prioritize the look and the feel of how the campus is going to run operationally. Then you have a look and see whether you've got messages that are coming through via email or Zoom calls or text messages just to see whether you need to have enough, staff members available should they call in sick or, if you've got lecturers that will have a last minute classroom adjustment instead of coming on campus, they're doing it online. So you sort of have to make sure that you're prioritizing all those roles and responsibilities in accordance to making sure that the place runs operationally without any major hiccups before you even start opening an email. It's just making sure that the functionalities of the campus runs smoothly at the beginning. And if you've got to cover lecturers or you've got to cover staff members, that you're there on standby to have contingency plans. So for me, it's just sort of looking after sort of the operational side of things on that scale. When we have students on campus, they usually are there. Obviously, we're greeting them on arrival every day and saying goodbye to them as they leave. But then you'll often come up with a lot of general student inquiries. So student inquiries vary across, their choice of subjects they're going to select, how they're going academically, concerns about attendances. So those are sort of the major sort of questions that we have. But in my role, I also handle complex cases. So, for example, it could be a situation where a student requires a brand new visa due to the fact that there's been a situation back home that their visa is going to be cancelled or denied. Or it could be a situation where a student has to go home due to a personal circumstances. So there's always policies and procedures in place for them for situations like this. And between obviously my team and the rest of the wider staff members, we try to make sure that we're supporting those students to deliver the outcomes that they're anticipating as well. Because often what happens is if we let it slide or we forget to give that sort of support that we need for those students, we run the real risk of losing those students and having such an unfavorable outcome. So we as a team just ensure that we support one another, but also make sure that those functionalities and those processes are adhered to.
Okay. Looking at this role and some of the earlier roles that you did. So we obviously first came, well, not obviously, but we came into contact first when you were the volunteer coordinator of the Student Guild at Griffith University. I want to ask you, based on that, what are some of the misconceptions that people have about the duties that are included in your roles?
I'm just trying to think of one of the events that I did at Student Guild. There was an activity, I think it was like a Halloween party, for example, where we required 10 or 12 volunteers. Actually, in that case, we can also include like the guild ball. So you're looking at anywhere between 500 to 1,000 students. You're trying to manage, 10 to 12 student volunteers. And, the perception is they think, I let my hair down and I have a couple of drinks. But in the background, you're conscious of, the students' welfare, especially when you're dealing with 500 to 1,000 students. Like people think that, I can do my job, but then also have a good time. But student welfare is such a massive implementation that you have. If one of my volunteers gets into a situation that makes them feel uncomfortable, surely you need to have some staff member or, security, for example, in this case, to really step in and try to support those volunteers. And I think that there was a time when I was running an event where security was not on hand for a situation that was being dealt with between a student and one of my volunteers. And I had to make sure that I stepped in, because I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to, accomplish a common goal in getting as many students into an event and having a good time. But then equally, it's making sure that the volunteers don't feel turned off from an interaction or an engagement that they have with another student. Because what will happen is that you want to develop a culture where you're going to get that support from not just staff, but also from, the coordinators, managers, security, and, sort of like the whole functioning team that, is putting together these events. And so what I think what often happens is that a lot of my, good friends and colleagues will have this perception of me like sort of letting my hair down. Yeah, sure. Every now and then you want to have that opportunity to let your hair down, but at the back of your mind, you're also thinking about the welfare of these students, and you are going to be the one that's going to answer to a manager or a supervisor should something go wrong or something happen. So you're always on call, regardless of where it's something that could be very small scale, where it could be something like electricity's gone off. That what I would consider as small scale, to very high risk and high pressure situations where a student is engaging with a very disgruntled student. They're under, the influence of alcohol. You kind of need to make sure that you're on it the moment that something happens, because you're trying to not just protect the student volunteer being involved, but also protecting the things that have been put in place to ensure that it's a safe and nurturing and caring event.
Well, you obviously do it very well, because you make it look very easy and you make it look like you're actually having a good time. So I suppose that's a great sign of the level of professionalism and understanding of all of the needs of everybody, because you don't openly look like you're there managing a situation. You look like, I'm just here and it's all going as as it should.
Of course, the show must go on, as they say in in the entertainment industry. The show must go on. So yeah,
Absolutely. So looking at the role that you do now, is there a general sort of, in terms of volume, how much of the work is directly student contact? How much of that is looking at compliance? How much of it might be admin, campus operations, those types of things? Is there a, the largest amount of my job is A, and then a little bit of it is this, or is it just really erratic?
yeah, it definitely fluctuates depending on whether you are on trimester or whether you're having a trimester break. For me, I would say 60 to 70% is more operationally. And that's just because you got to see things from a bigger lens pretty much. So much to the time that I previously worked in the industry, I remember being like 80, 90% is like student engagement. But as you start to get into those senior roles, it starts to sort of pull yourself apart from that student engagement side of things. So the way that I manage it is understand that, in my role, it's keeping the operational side of things rolling to ensure that you're not falling behind on, the level of engagement you're dealing with the students. Now, I still have the ability to engage with students. It's more so to the fact of whether they do need that additional support or well-being. So, for example, we may have a student that would come to us with a very sensitive topic. And whilst I have a student experience team that, can definitely give that nurturing care and support, they may potentially be not in the best position to handle that kind of scope of work. We have measures in place for situations like this when we have a student that's needing a bit of a welfare check. And we put those measures in place to ensure that they're getting that additional support that they need. So I do still have the ability to engage with the students, but I just have to remember that I have to look at everything from a wider scope that's not just purely on a student engagement basis. To answer your question, I would say 60, 70% would be operational side of things. Compliance, I would only say maybe 10, 20%. We have different people in different departments that look after the compliances. If there is a policy or a procedure where a student needs to go through a request process. And if something doesn't seem right, then that's when we probably would step in and actually have that sort of voice and opinion to share as well. So compliance is, whilst I sort of get exposed to it, I'm not necessarily too involved in that. And then the rest of that would be to do obviously with the engagement side of things as well. That engagement does tend to fluctuate depending on what time of the year we're dealing with.
Are there any tasks that you do that people outside of the industry probably not even aware are part of your job?
I would have to say the student welfare side of things is one that I think people need to be aware that it's a role that can really take a lot of energy. I think a lot of people that see it from the outside would assume that, we get to talk to students and we engage with them. When you've got a student that's under distress and you have to follow all those sort of procedures and policies and ensuring that they're getting all that additional support, it does take a lot out of you, both, mentally and physically as well. And I remember a time when I worked at Student Guild. When you're doing things and running things the way that it is, and you've got a hunch that a volunteer is acting differently or behaving in a way that sort of doesn't seem right, you almost want to go on the hunch that I feel like I need to ask those questions. And I would not be doing a service to any of the students who are part of the volunteer program not to ask that question. Because if I don't ask that question, who knows what's going to happen once they've done their shift, if they're going to feel okay, or if they want to be part of the program again, or if there's something that's sort of within sort of their world where they're not willing to share. And in probably the last couple of years, I think mental health and well-being has been one of the biggest sort of tier point measurements in ensuring that we keep student retention. And for me, losing volunteers because of, personal issues outside of it, it hurt. But then you have to ask yourself, have we asked the right questions? Have we provided the support that we need for these students to succeed in their roles? Have we provided any additional guidance? And could we have done something better to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again? And so when situations like that happen, we pause and reflect. You want things to be managed in a way that it doesn't impact the running of the operations of a volunteer program. So that's why it's important to ensure that you're taking care of every sort of step and procedures that you make for programs like this.
What's the difference then in helping students and then working with, say, lecturers and academics?
For me, it's just ensuring that, lecturers and academics are being looked after from the operational side of things. So, I look at sort of the role when I do timetabling, for example. I need to know what classes they're being assigned to for the next trimester. And then I also have to schedule it in accordance to their availability, but then equally what the program insists that they select and pick. But you also have to look at how that impacts students. You've got to make sure that classes don't clash with other lecturers. You need to make sure that there's other options for students to select. And then you have to look at the capacity in which that class can be run versus all the other classes that are happening throughout a particular block. It's like the chess piece above another chess piece. So the chess piece on top is obviously the academics who have their availabilities, who have the subjects that they need to study. But then below it is another chessboard where you have a student's life cycle of what subjects they need to select that doesn't impact them for what they need to pick in future trimesters. And where it becomes a bit of a challenge is we have to manage what students' expectations are when they're selecting the incorrect pathway to those subjects. Because if they start to pivot in a different direction, they run the risk of not being able to complete the subjects that they need to complete on time right before, they apply for their future graduate visas as well. That's probably one of the most complex parts of my role is, managing those expectations for lecturers and academics, not just through timetabling, but a whole platform of issues that they may have, whether it's running the classes, and there could be inquiries around using of AI or academic misconduct. We are sort of almost like the middle person between what we're engaging with students, but then also with the academic heads and lecturers as well. So we have a very robust way of managing those sort of expectations, but then making sure that we run things effectively so that both academics and lecturers, along with the students, have a happy medium to sort of run things the way it is.
Anybody who's ever tried to enroll in a class at a university or any higher education institution, even that alone is a minefield, right? Because you know you have to juggle so many things. I've got to get these subjects covered this semester. Oh, but that doesn't work with my schedule, and I can't even begin to imagine what they from the actual coordination side of however many thousands of people are involved in terms of coming to class and running classes. So hats off to you for getting through that. What kind of skills do you think are really most important in the type of work that you do?
One of the biggest things for me that I've learnt is developing empathy. And I think as time went in my career, my level of empathy has sort of grown. It's not to say that I didn't have empathy at the very beginning of this role. It was just that, when you've worked in sales and marketing and you're working with different suppliers, it was almost like a very competitive environment where you're trying to outsmart other organizations to get ahead with the product that you're selling. Where I had that moment where I literally had to pivot was, understanding that these are students that are having needs and wants all the time. It's actually kind of a big deal for them, especially when they come to a country like Australia where they're not familiar with the environment. They're very unknown to their surroundings and they just want to be able to settle here without having to have all those dramas. So one of the things that I learned was having to develop a bit of empathy, because without that empathy, when you're dealing and talking with students, you're going to come across as someone who doesn't have the best interest for the students at heart. These students are coming here, have invested their time to come to Australia just to ensure that they have the best experience. And without having that sort of empathetic mindset, you could lose them because it would come across as very cold-hearted not to display that level of empathy towards them. So for me, that success really comes down to, developing that empathy. And I think being able just to have everything at the pulse. You look at all the current trends that are happening. You're looking at all the different types of technologies that are being introduced, trying to ensure that you're not falling behind on what you're doing and how you're functioning within sort of any higher education. And lastly, flexibility was the other one I would think of as well. Things change in the education sector. COVID really made me pivot to the domestic student market. And that was an area that I thought, okay, if I really want to stay in this industry, I really need to start exploring other options beyond just the international students. For me, it was like, okay, if I want to stay in the education sector, do I need to tap into the domestic student market, or do I need to go early childhood education? Those were sort of things that I was tossing up. And without having that flexibility, anyone that wants to get into this sector without having those sort of three acumens is really going to have some challenges for, wanting to progress in the future as well. And I think that those are real opportunities where it can be developed, whether those are entry roles or whether you come into management or senior management roles as well.
If you're enjoying the show, why don't you drop me a like and subscribe right now? And also leave a comment below to let me know what you like about the show, or if there's any kind of content that you'd like to see in future episodes. So Shane, can you tell me how important boundaries are when you're working with students?
For me, boundaries are very important when it comes to, engaging with students. One of the core things that I hear from students is that, they often feel very isolated, very lonely, especially if, they've come from different parts of the world. Depending on the role that you are in, you need to know where those boundaries are set. As a role as an activities officer, those boundaries are sort of only within sort of like the activities that you do with the students to ensure that it gives you all those successful outcomes as well. And then as I went into more senior roles and more management roles, I sort of knew that, there would be no way that those boundaries could be ever crossed. Where it's difficult is when students don't understand why those boundaries are set. And thankfully, when I did work at the language school at the beginning, I signed a separate contract that made it very clear that, that there's none of those boundaries that are ever allowed to be crossed. And because when I was able to do all these activities where alcohol was involved or we're going into an 18 plus club, you kind of needed to know where you stand in terms of your responsibilities, but then equally ensuring that you don't do something that will cause harm not just on yourself, but perhaps to the student, but also to the organization as well.
I know, even just having worked in universities myself, especially with mature age students, you obviously can connect on many levels with some of those people. And then, you have a session with somebody and they'll say, oh, do you want to come and do this with us on the weekend? And you're like, I can't do that. I understand where you're coming from and thank you, but I'm a staff member and you're a student and
Yeah.
that's just not allowed. So, and it's tough, right? Because you want to be involved with these people. You want to make their experience as good as it can be. But there are just things where you just have to draw the line and say, thank you, but I just can't do that. Can you tell me maybe some types of situations where you have to exercise more judgment rather than look at a process? Does that ever come up?
I remember doing a invigilation for a student that's requiring to do a supplementary assessment. And what happened was I remember sitting in that room with the student and I thought everything was running smoothly within sort of like the first 20 minutes of this invigilation. And within the next 30 minutes, I get a question from the student saying, Shane, can I have a conversation with you? And again, I wasn't sure, obviously, where my boundaries was around being an invigilator, what to do. We sort of got to a situation where the student was not feeling 100%. And obviously, this was a timed assessment. So you kind of had to ask yourself, well, does the student need to go to the bathroom? Does the student need to have a break? Does the student need to have some water or something? I saw him, feeling very exhausted, almost out of breath. And from there, it was a situation where I had to make an executive call that this invigilation cannot continue because we have a student that could almost collapse on me or could be out of breath or, his heart would stop, because I just remember sitting there and he's just like, he's clenching and I just sort of went into a period of, oh, this usually doesn't happen. And there was a point where I didn't know what the process was. It was literally me just taking notes, making sure the student is 100% okay to continue, listening and hearing out what they want to do, and then providing with all the support that they need. There are so many things that, policies and procedures are there in place for, but in a situation where a student, is panicking and just needing that support and just needing a little bit of time just to step away from the stresses that they were dealing with, you've got to make a clear judgment. And that was for me, a perfect example of a case where I needed to prioritize the student's well-being over a policy and procedure of what happens when they don't complete their supplementary assessment.
Look, and absolutely, and I'm sure in any role, there's always going to be some kind of scenario that there does not yet exist a process for, right? And you just have to be able to make that call. You mentioned, so we're circling back now, you mentioned before some things that can be a little bit more difficult or challenging. So what parts of this work could therefore be draining or repetitive or difficult that people should just be aware of? And we'll get to the good stuff as well.
Yeah, of course. I think for me, it's the volume of student engagement and interactions that you get, depending on what those cases are. So at any given time, you could be speaking to one student and you're dealing with a process around enrolling them into class or, where my classroom is. Those are sort of those, let's say, low level kind of questions that don't require such, involvement. But when you start getting, one complex case, say, for example, a student needs to get into a particular class, but because of the capacity, it's now full. It's like, okay, you've got this one case and it's got all the different policies and procedures and processes that you need to complete that step. It's when it starts piling up, you then start to decide, okay, which one becomes the priority. Usually what happens when it drains my team, it's when you look at the volume that they have to deal with. And so, coming into our enrollment process, once you handle one student case, depending on its complexities, you're going to start comparing all the other student cases that you're going to be receiving. And where that sort of becomes the biggest challenge is having so many that you start just getting so overwhelmed. And so it's just important that, when you're put into tasks for something like enrollments, is that you're looking through things quite thoroughly, but making sure that it doesn't overwhelm you. But then equally making sure that if there are cases that can be tackled instantly without having impacting other students, that they can be best handled without having all that additional pressure as well. So that could be, for me, an example of managing those sort of those stresses and ensuring that the team can work harmoniously with the students but then also with the team as well.
So on the flip side of that then, what are the rewarding parts of working in these types of student-facing roles?
I think the primary reward for me when it comes to, working with students is you're going along with them in a journey. It's the journey side of things. These are students who, invest quite a bit of money, wanting to start a career. And, the first step to getting to that career is obviously through their studies. Now, whether that's domestic or international students, every student's story is so uniquely different. So when you invest that time and energy to sitting down and listening to, the stories, where they've come from, why are they here, what are they doing this for? When students start opening up to us and they share a part of their story in a way that we can connect and engage with them, we see that reward at the very end when they collect their testima and they're, smiling in front of the camera, in front of all their peers and also their family and friends, because we feel like we're a part of that journey. And it's just exciting to see how they started at the beginning, very shy, very scared, very nervous to begin with. And then once you get to that end, they become a whole completely different person with a more optimistic, life getting ahead of them and knowing that they're going to get that support, for many, many years to come as well. So I still have such great relationships with some of the past students I've had just due to the fact that, we've built such a great culture and society, whichever organization I work for, and they get to share some of their, personal goals and achievements, whether that's through LinkedIn or, through their socials. Some of them are opening up businesses and, running, social groups, for example, as sort of like their side project, or, they're starting a family as well. So there's so much that students share from a journey perspective. And once they finish, that journey just sort of continues on to opportunities that will skyrocket them to sort of bigger and better opportunities as well. So for me, that's the reason why I've been in this industry for such a long time, is because the reward is seeing where the students were from the beginning and being part of that journey when they finish and beyond.
So for anybody considering this type of work, are there any sorts of entry points that people can get in?
Anyone that really wants to enter into sort of the education space, I would say it's the hunger and determination to get in that space. I know that sounds a bit strange because obviously I did it sort of through a networking perspective. Like I had someone that worked in that industry, and obviously I was sort of the right person and the right fit. But if you're a student wanting to get sort of into this sector, you kind of want to have the hunger and the drive to really be involved and engage with, the particular student space. So I found that, at Student Guild, when, you've got volunteers that are, being out there and, engaging and interacting with the students, you really need to do it with a sense of purpose. But then equally just looking at what are those opportunities that are going to be offered to you once you, have done your hours of, volunteering, at the campus. And I know that one of the things that employees are looking for is that ability to be flexible, to be able to take on different projects and assessments whilst managing, your studies at the same time, because that's going to look very desirable for any future employee wanting to see someone diversifying their skill sets and looking at giving back to the community. I remember with the volunteers at Student Guild, they got to experience, volunteering within the student community. There were opportunities where they can connect within the Griffith Uni faculties. And I know that most of those volunteers have also gone on to do paid roles within the university, whether that's, through the uni bar or the gym or, event assistants, working alongside Student Guild as well. There are so many pathways for students to get to possible career opportunities. It's just finding the hunger and the drive to know what you're looking for, but then to equally network with the right type of people. Often, if there was one advice I would say when it comes to networking, especially from a student perspective, make sure you're just not networking with the students that are within your cohort. Network with the individuals and those industry professionals and experts that are in that field to provide you with that kind of support and engagement. I think that that's what makes, university such a great opportunity for students to practice those soft skills, because it's going to give them the avenues to become, industry professionals, whatever role that they want to take up.
Sure. And if somebody was already, quite a few years into their career and decided that they like the look of education in a non-academic sort of role, what sorts of roles would transfer well into this?
You'd probably have to look at like entry level positions, and most of those entry level positions are predominantly administration based, whether those are entry roles within administration. So those, again, taking phone calls, engaging with student questions and inquiries. And then from there, you can sort of pivot to sort of specific roles. So, in the role of, being an activities officer, you're researching and looking at all the activities that you could be doing, during the winter months versus the summer months as well. And then also looking at other ways to upskill, whether that's understanding the ESOS Act or the CRICOS Act as well. There's a whole plethora of opportunities there. And I think it really just comes down, again, what I mentioned as the hunger and drive to wanting to be part of the education sector.
How does progression usually work then in this area? Is it about leadership? Is it about the specialist knowledge? Obviously, you talk about all of the different frameworks that you operate under. Is it compliance? Is it student services? And again, I would look at that too from a point of, say, I suddenly decided that I wanted to go and work in some sort of student-facing administrative role in a higher education space. Because I know, obviously, I look at ads for job ads all the time for people. Often in higher education, they want a degree of some sort as a starting point, and then you might have 10 or 15 years of work behind you. How do you then move in, and then how do those types of people progress up into the types of roles that you're doing? Do those people still have to start in, obviously not volunteering, but, maybe in that admissions officer type role or something, or, can you speak to that?
Yeah. So once they get into those entry level roles, usually you look at that journey as like a 1 to 2 year journey for most of those staff members. And then from there, there's usually an expectation for staff in the education space to start developing additional skill sets. So, when you mentioned about admissions process, there's going to be, steps and policies that are going to be specifically under the admissions framework. And then where you add the complexity is obviously based on the nationality. You have to have a look and see, how it meets, all the visa requirements for countries in South America or countries in Europe. So, again, it's just developing those skill sets within the framework. And then from there, it's just making sure that you are open to those opportunities that will sort of test your waters in terms of wanting to progress, in a future sort of career as well. So I know that when I moved to Melbourne, when I worked for Deakin University, I was entering into the accommodation sector, which, whilst I had some small knowledge of it from working at the language school, what it made me do is sort of hone in on some of what I thought was the knowledge that I could bring in to Deakin Uni, but I had to learn a whole different platform. I had to learn a whole different policies and procedures that are set in place, and all the software and technology that is embedded within Deakin Uni's accommodation sector. But then obviously there was all the other different policies and procedures that are coming through as well. I think when you get into these sort of entry level roles, yes, you're going to sort of get used to all those, policies and procedures and the sort of all those tasks that you do on a Monday to Friday basis. But it's ensuring to maintain that level of interest is being willing to open to understanding a different avenue of what the education sector does to sort of maintain those functionalities and the operational side of things. And I think for me, when it came to, understanding my role as an assistant campus manager, there's definitely some things within the facility space that I needed to tap in more, that you're dealing with stakeholders who, it could be air conditioning issues, or it could be, fire alarms that are going off. And obviously what you need to sort of have a look in is, Are we being compliant with, the regulators that are looking after those fire alarms? Are you compliant with all these different facets of, facilities that I've never touched
Yep.
on, but knowing that it's an essential part in the role. So you've got to be willing to adapt to whatever role and position you are, but having to always pivot to ensure that your knowledge is well diverse in scenarios or situations that, you wouldn't have thought in the first place you needed, but you kind of need now.
Who do you think is well suited to this work?
Anyone that wants to get into the education sector, they need to have a love and passion for students. And it's going to come down to, really developing those, that empathy that I mentioned earlier. It's got to be someone that has, again, the hunger and the drive of wanting to be in the industry and just really wanting to make a difference for these students. And there are going to be some people that will always want to just consider the administration side of things. But there's going to be that level of element where you need to be able to have that flexibility to engage with students. And where I see my career progression personally is being able to, step outside sort of what most sort of industry professionals do in terms of their day to day into really making an impact on every student that walks through that door. The students that we engage with, they could be the ones that, should we want to do a holiday in South America, they'd probably be the people that we'd reach out and be like, hey, where can we go if I'm traveling for the next 3 weeks? Or they could be the individuals that'd be like, look, I kind of want to be like you in the future, but I want to do it in a university in Europe. How do I get myself involved and how do I get myself engaged? And I think that's really a way that you can sort of tap in, because there are always going to be opportunities for people to get into this industry. You just need to have the right mindset to really value the power of what students can do for you, but what they can do for themselves, so that you share that journey with them as well.
Who might struggle in this type of environment? Who might apply for a role in this kind of space, and then find out that it's really not for them? Who's that person?
Yeah. I think it's got to be someone that will probably struggle in this industry would be someone that doesn't have that level of patience. For me, I think patience is such a big part of that because, as I said, students, whether they're domestic or international, they're going to be just flooding you with one request after the other. And it's just this expectation that you're going to be answering every question or inquiry that they're going to throw at you. So if you don't show a level of patience with them, or you act or behave in a way that doesn't sit well with them or makes that student experience be a bit of a turnoff, those are those people that are going to really struggle getting into this industry. You've got to be open and agile to opportunities and areas to just engage. And anyone that just wants to sit in a silo, going through emails, going through those inquiries, are not giving themselves the opportunity just to expose themselves to the community. You build a culture through how you engage, not just with the students, but also with the academics and the lecturers and the staff members that you work in. And where I build the success that I have in my current role is really making sure that everything just works hand in hand, so that we're delivering the services that are required and making sure that there's a happy medium.
That's a very thorough overview of, working with students, but not in those academic and sort of teacher or staff type roles,
Yeah.
which is exactly what I was after, because that's what we think about. We think about higher education. Oh, you're a teacher, you're a lecturer, you're whatever. Okay, so for a rapid fire little round of questions here, what was some really good career advice that you were given that you ignored initially, but later on discovered was right?
Trying to remember when I was at the language school, I remember doing that for 5 years. And I just know that I loved what I was doing for such a long time that I didn't want to leave that role. And I remember just before my manager left, he gave me the advice of, swing for the fences and explore other opportunities. And the reason why I ignored that at the beginning was I loved what I was doing. I enjoyed creating these activities, engaging with these students outside of the classroom to provide them with such a great experience. And the reason why I ignored it at the beginning was because I just was so comfortable with what I was doing. And I loved every moment that sometimes the weekend excursions to, Byron Bay or Moreton Island, they were like almost like a holiday for me. And I was so oblivious to advice from other people. The life cycle of my role only was a 2-year period. I did that role for 5 years. It was when my boss left, that's when I started to take a bit of a moment to be like, okay, now I think I realized why he gave me that piece of advice. I knew I was getting older. It was hard to keep up with the amount of activities that you're putting together. If I still continued doing what I was doing, I'd probably be in my late 50s, still taking them to activities that, for me were fun at the beginning, but they weren't going to be fun later on in life. So that was
And look
probably
where you are now.
that is. No, look where I'm now. I'm now managing a campus, and that's a whole, opportunity from there as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Okay. What has been the one skill that's helped you more than any qualification you might have?
I would say empathy again. That to me wasn't through what I was doing, what I was learning in marketing or communications at all. It was realizing that students are also human beings. They do have feelings. They do want to, have their questions resolved. They need that support. And without having a sit down with them and understanding what they're going through, I wouldn't be able to show that level of empathy to where I am now. So for me, empathy is definitely something that I learned that doesn't require a qualification.
Excellent. If you had to start again tomorrow, what would you focus on first?
I think for me, when I remember when I was at university, I was so fixated on trying to finish my degree. I was so fixated to the point where I neglected the networking and the connection side of things from all my, academics and lecturers. And the reason why I say that is because where I work now, there's been such an emphasis around, you know, networking and, getting career focus and working on an internship. If only I had that mindset at the very beginning when I started my degree to network and connect with people within, the university, and to have a look at see what internships or what opportunities I would have had, I would have easily have gone straight into a full-time position. Like it took me 3 to 4 years just to get into a full-time position working for a mini golf company. But that I had to sort of stay within my very first job for over 10 years. But I just was so reluctant or hesitant at that time. And I only developed that level of confidence pretty much years after I finished uni. So had I done it again, I would have been able to, do a degree that I was after, because I actually went from doing 4 different disciplines just as I wanted to, complete my course in marketing communications, which, you know what, in a student life cycle, it often happens. So if students are, keep course correcting and changing, it's the part of the student cycle. It happens. I just wish that I was more forefront in my networking connections within the university sector, because I knew that it would have given me a full-time job much quicker, much earlier, had I had that focus right after I've completed my uni studies.
I've had a very similar answer in previous episodes, and I'm glad that that's one of the things that you said because, and having worked in the university space, I literally want to scream from the roofs as people are coming in the gates the first day, start networking today.
Yep.
Too many people think, oh, I'll do that when I get to the end. And
Yep.
then I've sat at careers expos where people are in their end of their second year and they're sort of saying, oh, I need to get an internship. How do I do that? And I sort of say, well, you reach out to your network, and they go, I don't have a network. I haven't done that yet. I'll do that later. So day one, you need to start
Yep.
at day one. I just want to say to anybody, that is the thing that you never put off till later. Doesn't matter where you are now. If you haven't done it yet, start now. But yeah, absolutely. If you're a university student from day one, network
Yeah.
within people in other courses, network with your lecturers, network with the people in the careers teams and every other
Yep.
team and member of staff that you can, because you never know where an opportunity is going to come from or who can help you later on. All
I
right.
agree.
Last question. It's a little bit similar, but this
Hmm.
does not necessarily relate to your career.
Hmm.
But if you were giving 18-year-old Shane some advice, what would you tell him to try sooner?
Wow. What I would tell my 18-year-old self, this is going to sound really contradictory. Probably to grow up. You can say when you get to
Grow
18.
up sooner.
Um, yeah, why not? I mean, when you get to 18, I think a lot of us, they tend to, sort of be young at heart and everything. But I think, for me, it's just making sure that I know exactly what I want. I think that was the thing that I sort of realized is that, know what you want and start networking when you can and start being able to take risks, knowing that whatever the consequences are, whatever the rewards are, that you're going to accept it. And I think that 18-year-old self looking back was a bit worried of, oh, do I really want to move to a different industry? Do I really want to, having worked at the cinemas for 10 years, do I really want to go to a different job? But if you don't swing for the fences and you don't take on these opportunities at such a young age, when are you going to do that? And a lot of it, you're going to have those pivotal moments when you're young. So if you're not willing to, take a gamble and, do a different career pathway or look for an opportunity elsewhere, you're going to shoot yourself pretty badly by not taking those opportunities. And, I encourage anyone, whether they're, 18 or 30 or whatever, age bracket they are, if they're looking for a moment to just pivot in life, whether that's a career opportunity or a moment where they just want a fresh new start, they just need to have a look at how they're going to do that and what's achievable. Because one thing that I always tell students is never leave an opportunity without exploring that. Because if the opportunity has been handed to you and you just dismiss it, then it could be an opportunity that you're going to regret later on. And I know that a lot of the students who have come to Australia do 12 or 40 weeks of studying, and they're like, oh, we could do that activity later. Oh, it can wait. Oh, I don't have the money for it and everything. That level of pessimism, that will sort of be what's going to really impact them for those sort of future decisions. So while they're here, take it as it comes and just swing for the fences, because you never know whether the risk is one that has its consequences and you have lessons learned, or it could be a rewarding opportunity that will open new doors and opportunities elsewhere. I think anyone could really put that mindset of just start swinging for the fences and making things work for them.
You're not the first person here to have said take more risks earlier.
Yeah.
We're very risk averse, I find, especially when we're younger, because we think, oh, if that fails, I've failed. And
Yep.
you know what? You can always change direction and
Yep.
start over. And then very often it's the things we didn't do that we regret, not the things
Yep.
that we did do, right? Because what you didn't do is always then left unknown. And then you're
Hmm.
always wondering, what if, what if, what if? So
Yeah.
better to explore it. And if it doesn't work out, who cares? Do something new. But it could be something great. Well, this has been
Absolutely.
great. So I wanted to thank you very much for your time today in sharing your career story and giving people some real insight to what it's like to work in an education institution, but not be one of those sort of academic or teaching roles. So thanks again. And I look forward to whatever potentially your next step is in the world of education.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the time and the chat. It was great.
That's all right. It's my pleasure. Before we wrap up today, here are 3 key takeaways from my conversation with Shane. Firstly, higher education does not run through teaching and academic roles alone. There is a whole layer of student-facing and campus operations work happening behind the scenes, from student inquiries and enrolments to room setup, lecturer support, timetabling, welfare checks, and keeping a campus functioning day to day. These roles may not always be visible, but they are a major part of how students actually experience their education. Secondly, these roles are not just general admin jobs. Shane talked about the need for empathy, patience, and good judgment, especially when students are stressed, isolated, overwhelmed, or dealing with complex personal situations. But he also made it clear that care has to sit alongside professional boundaries. You are supporting students, not becoming their friend, counsellor, or personal safety net. That balance is a real skill. And finally, this can be a real career path for people who like education, people, systems, and problem solving, even if they are not teachers or academics. Shane's own pathway moved through sales, marketing, student activities, accommodation, student guild work, student support, and now campus management. The common thread was being willing to learn, network, take opportunities, and keep adapting as each role opened up a new part of the education sector. If you're enjoying the show, make sure you like and subscribe so that you get all future content, and be sure to share this with anyone else who might be exploring careers. If there's a profession that you're keen to hear about, leave me a comment below and I'll see if I can turn that into a future episode for you. That's all for this week on Work Uncovered. And remember, you can't be what you can't see. So until next time, always be curious.